Hi, I'm Reagan and my research question is which is more effective in the United States, violent or nonviolent protest? Out of the stimulus materials, the letter from Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King Jr. and the song Blowin' in the Wind by Bob Dylan helped me create this question because the letter from Birmingham jail helped emphasize the importance of nonviolent protest, and Blowin' in the Wind represented an example of a nonviolent protest. Violent protests are protests marked by the use of a destructive or physical force. These types of protests create massive shock value, but are also very costly. First, they spark massive media coverage. For instance, the Stonewall riots of 1969 became the face of the modern LGBT rights movement. In addition, the Kent State riots of 1970 became the face of the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War. The U.S. wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for violent protest. For example, when the U.S. decided they wanted to gain independence from Britain, a number of violent riots ensued. Stamp Act riots, Boston Tea Party, and of course the American Revolution. However, is being passionate about what you're protesting really worth dying/being severely injured over? And it also causes a ripple effect of grief from your friends and family. In addition, it's not always successful. The Detroit race riots only resulted in new legislation that enforced stricter discrimination laws and stricter police protocols regarding hiring minorities. Additionally, police are far more equipped to handle violent protest. According to Gwen Staffer, reporter with the PhD in mass media/communication from Temple University, claims that tasers, beanbag launchers, concussion grenades, pepper balls, and flashbangs are routinely used during violent political demonstrations. Therefore, Americans are less likely to participate in violent campaigns because they would have to take up arms or risk their lives. On the other hand, nonviolent protests are protests that practice achieving goals of social change through civil disobedience, symbolic protest, or economic and political non-cooperation. These types of protests are more effective than violent protests. First, they're far more likely to succeed. Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Stephen, authors of Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, conducted a study of 323 violent and nonviolent protests between 1900 to 2006. And they found that nonviolent protests were twice as likely to succeed as their violent counterparts. Furthermore, they found that 3 out of 4 nonviolent protests are successful compared to 1 out of 4 violent protests. In addition, they have higher participation rates because they don't go against moral values and have less risk of injury. Nonviolent protests also produce more change. For instance, thousands of acts of civil disobedience, Students for a Democratic Society, large-scale resistance to the military draft, and music The Protest of the War were the real reasons behind the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam, not just the Kent State riots. Additionally, the civil rights movement proved that nonviolent resistance is far more effective than violent resistance. For example, 200,000 protesters gathered for the March on Washington. As a result, Martin Luther King Jr. was able to meet with President John F. Kennedy and helped establish the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Similarly, the Stonewall riots may define LGBT protest, but the March on Washington for lesbian, gay, and bi-equal rights and liberation in 1993 may have been more effective. Over 800,000 protesters gathered at the National Mall to seek anti-discrimination laws on the basis of sexual identity and demanded further research for HIV and AIDS. As a result, same-sex marriage was legalized in 2015, and tremendous amounts of funding went towards looking for a cure for HIV and AIDS. However, nonviolence can help incite violence. Some historians argue that conservative pro-life protesters paved the way for liberal pro-life protesters to conduct extremely violent protests in the 1980s where abortion doctors were killed. Moreover, other historians believe the nonviolent protests of the civil rights era paved the way for violent civil rights protesters such as Weather Underground and the Black Panthers. Nonviolent protests are effective due to the number of participants and the diversity within those participants. However, unorganized nonviolent protests don't include either of those factors, so not all nonviolent protests are truly effective. Therefore, people need to be more educated about different methods of nonviolent resistance. Gene Sharp, founder of the Albert Einstein Institute, a nonprofit organization devoted to studying nonviolent resistance, compiled a list of over 40 methods of nonviolent protest. This list includes walkouts, singing, sit-ins, prayer, silence, etc. These unorthodox methods will hopefully gain more media coverage and evoke positive change. Additionally, Jamila Raquib, executive director at the Einstein Institute, insists that to make more protests more effective, protesters must have clear objectives, strategies, and cut off the resources the opposed group needs to function. In conclusion, nonviolent protesters have proven to be more effective than violent protesters. And to make nonviolent protests even more effective, protests need to be more organized and stand out from a typical protest. Thank you.